Karen Thompson was the kind of person who always seemed to have an opinion on everything. In her mind, she wasn't just another homeowner in the gated community. She was the homeowner. Her neighbors often joked that if there were a crown for her, being the most involved or over-involved resident, Karen would wear it proudly every day. She wasn't officially elected as the head of the Homeowners Association. She simply declared herself the leader and acted like it. Over time, no one bothered to argue because they knew better than to cross her. Karen's rules were legendary. She had strong feelings about almost everything: how tall your grass could grow, what color your front door should be, whether you could leave your trash cans visible from the street, even the type of holiday decorations you hung outside. To her, these weren't trivial matters. They were vital to maintaining the prestige of their neighborhood. If someone dared to break one of her unwritten laws, they'd receive a sternly worded letter or find themselves publicly shamed at the next HOA meeting. Some people thought she enjoyed making others squirm, but Karen saw herself as a protector of order. Without her, she believed, chaos would reign supreme. Her obsession with control wasn't limited to aesthetics either. Karen kept tabs on everyone's comings and goings. Late-night parties? Not under her watch. Loud music? Forget about it. Even kids playing basketball in driveways after school earned her disapproving glare. The neighborhood kids nicknamed her the Hawk because she perched by her living room window, ready to swoop down whenever something or someone caught her attention. It was hard not to feel like you were living under a microscope when Karen was around. Despite all this, Karen wasn't entirely disliked. Sure, some neighbors found her exhausting, but others admired her dedication. They figured having someone so invested in keeping things tidy and organized wasn't the worst thing in the world. Plus, nobody wanted to deal with the hassle of running the HOA themselves. So, grumbling aside, most residents played along, following her rules to avoid conflict. After all, life is easier when you don't rock the boat. One crisp autumn morning, however, everything changed. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. Mr. Harold Jenkins, one of its kindest and most beloved residents, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Harold wasn't flashy or wealthy. He drove an old sedan and wore clothes that looked decades out of style, but he had a heart bigger than anyone else's. He remembered everyone's name, offered gardening advice to struggling new homeowners, and always greeted passers-by with a warm smile. For many, Harold represented the soul of the community. His absence left a void that felt impossible to fill. Plans were made for a proper send-off. The funeral service would take place at the local church, followed by a procession through the neighborhood where Harold had lived for over 30 years. This route held special meaning. It allowed friends, family, and neighbors to say their final goodbyes as the hearse slowly wound its way toward the cemetery. Dozens of cars lined up behind the black vehicle, adorned with flowers and small flags, fluttering gently in the breeze. Everyone agreed it was fitting tribute to such a remarkable man. But as fate would have it, Karen had other plans. Unbeknownst to the mourners, their quiet farewell was about to turn into something far more dramatic and unforgettable. Little did they know, Karen's need for control was about to collide with a moment none of them expected her to interfere with. What happened next would shock not only the neighborhood but also the entire town, and maybe even the internet. As the engines started and the procession began moving forward, anticipation hung heavy in the air. Friends and family exchanged tearful glances, holding tissues tightly in trembling hands. Children peeked out car windows, sensing the gravity of the occasion despite their young age. Everything seemed peaceful, until Karen stepped onto the scene. What unfolded next will go down in history as one of the strangest yet most talked about moments anyone could ever imagine happening during a funeral. The morning air was cool and crisp as the funeral procession began its slow journey through the neighborhood. The hearse, sleek and solemn, led the way, followed by a long line of cars filled with grieving family members, friends, and neighbors. Each vehicle moved at a steady pace, creating a somber rhythm that matched the mood of the day. Onlookers stood quietly along the sidewalks, bowing their heads in respect, or waving gently to show support for Harold's loved ones. It was a moment meant to honor his memory, a final farewell shared by those who cared about him deeply. Karen, however, was not among those paying their respects. Instead, she sat inside her immaculately decorated living room, sipping coffee, while keeping an eye on the street outside. She'd heard about Harold's passing, of course. News traveled fast in their tight-knit community. But it hadn't registered much with her beyond a vague sense of acknowledgement. To Karen, funerals were just another event, something that happened occasionally but didn't require her personal involvement. Her focus remained firmly on what mattered most, maintaining order within her neighborhood. As the procession approached her cul-de-sac, Karen noticed the growing number of cars inching past her house. At first, she felt only mild irritation. "Why does this have to go through here?" she muttered under her breath, setting down her mug. But then, as the line stretched longer and longer, her annoyance turned into full-blown frustration. The sound of idling engines and occasional honks disrupted the usual tranquility of the area. Neighbors lingered near the curb, whispering condolences and watching the procession pass by. In Karen's mind, all of this amounted to unnecessary commotion, and she couldn't stand it. Suddenly, Karen sprang into action. Throwing open her front door, she marched outside, barefoot and determined. Her bathrobe flapped behind her as she strode toward the middle of the road, arms raised like a traffic cop trying to halt an unruly crowd. "Stop! Stop right there!" she shouted, her voice shrill enough to cut through the quiet murmur of the mourners. Drivers exchanged confused glances, unsure whether they should obey or ignore her command. "This is ridiculous," Karen continued, planting herself directly in front of the lead car behind the hearse. "You can't just block the entire street like this. What about everyone else who needs to get through? Have you thought about that?" Her words hung awkwardly in the air. No one responded, not because they didn't want to, but because no one knew how to react. How do you reason with someone interrupting a funeral procession? A few brave souls rolled down their windows to explain politely that this was a scheduled event, a necessary part of honoring Harold's life. But Karen wasn't listening. She waved her hands dismissively, insisting that the rules of the neighborhood took precedence over anything else. When it became clear that no one intended to reroute the procession, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. Storming back to her driveway, she climbed into her shiny silver SUV, revved the engine, and pulled out with surprising speed. Without hesitation, she positioned her vehicle sideways across the narrow street, effectively blocking the path of every car behind her. Horns blared in protest, but Karen ignored them, folding her arms across her chest as if daring anyone to challenge her authority. The scene quickly descended into chaos. Mourners leaned out of their windows, shouting questions and pleading for Karen to move. Some begged her to reconsider, explaining how important this moment was for Harold's family. Others expressed disbelief at her audacity, wondering aloud how anyone could be so selfish during such a sensitive time. Yet Karen remained unmoved, her face set in a stubborn scowl. "This isn't about me," she snapped back, though her actions suggested otherwise. "It's about following the rules. If you don't like it, take it up with the HOA." Time seemed to stretch endlessly as the standoff dragged on. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling heavier than the last. The delay caused ripples of distress throughout the procession. Harold's elderly wife, sitting in the front seat of a family car, began sobbing uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the tension and frustration. Her children tried to comfort her, but even they struggled to keep their composure. Friends exchanged worried glances, fearing the disruption might ruin what was supposed to be a dignified tribute. Meanwhile, Karen clung to her conviction, refusing to budge despite the mounting pressure. She genuinely believed she was doing the right thing, or at least the responsible thing. In her mind, allowing the procession to continue unchecked would set a dangerous precedent. What if other events started causing similar disruptions? Who would protect the neighborhood then? These thoughts swirled in her head, reinforcing her resolve even as the situation spiraled further out of control. Finally, after nearly 20 excruciating minutes, a neighbor stepped forward and called the police. By this point, tempers were running high, and several people had whipped out their phones to record the bizarre spectacle unfolding before them. Videos captured Karen's defiant stance, her SUV cutting off the procession, and the emotional toll it took on Harold's loved ones. Within hours, these clips would spread online, turning Karen into an unwitting viral sensation, and not in a good way. For now, though, the immediate concern was resolving the impasse. Officers arrived swiftly, their presence bringing a mix of relief and unease. As they approached Karen, she launched into a lengthy explanation, gesturing wildly and referencing obscure HOA guidelines. But the officers weren't interested in her justifications. They calmly informed her that obstructing a funeral procession was not only disrespectful, but potentially illegal. When they asked her to move her car, Karen hesitated, clearly torn between defiance and compliance. Eventually, realizing she had no choice, she relented and climbed back into her SUV, backing it out of the way with obvious reluctance. With the road finally clear, the procession resumed its journey, albeit with a lingering cloud of tension hanging over it. For many participants, the interruption had tainted what should have been a sacred moment, and for Karen, the consequences of her actions were only beginning to unfold. Little did she know, her decision to hijack the funeral procession would soon lead to far more trouble than she ever anticipated. As the funeral procession finally moved forward after Karen's dramatic intervention, the tension in the air was palpable. The mourners tried to refocus on the purpose of the day, honoring Harold, but it was impossible to shake off what had just happened. Conversations buzzed quietly among the cars as they inched along the route. Some expressed anger, others disbelief, and a few even laughed nervously at the absurdity of the situation. But one thing was certain: no one could believe that someone would disrupt such a deeply personal and sacred moment. Back in her SUV, Karen sat fuming. She hadn't meant for things to escalate so dramatically. In her mind, she was simply enforcing the rules she'd spent years upholding. Sure, maybe she'd overreacted slightly, but wasn't it her duty to ensure the neighborhood ran smoothly? As she drove home, her thoughts raced. Would people understand where she was coming from? Or would they side with the mourners and turn against her? Deep down, she suspected the latter, but she pushed those worries aside, convincing herself that she'd done nothing wrong. What Karen didn't realize was that the story of her actions was already spreading like wildfire. A neighbor who had recorded the incident posted the video online within minutes of the confrontation ending. It didn't take long for the clip to gain traction. Social media users were quick to latch onto the drama, dubbing her Funeral Karen almost instantly. Memes began circulating, showing Karen blocking the procession with captions like, "When life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Unless it's a funeral, then just move your car." Late-night talk show hosts picked up the story, turning it into comedic fodder. Within hours, Karen became a household name, not for her dedication to the HOA, but for her shocking behavior during Harold's final send-off. The backlash hit hard and fast. Comments poured in from all corners of the internet, ranging from criticism to outright mockery. People questioned how anyone could prioritize rules over human decency, especially during such an emotional time. Others shared stories of their own experiences dealing with overzealous HOA leaders, comparing them to Karen's antics. Meanwhile, local news outlets scrambled to cover the story, interviewing neighbors and digging into Karen's history as the self-proclaimed enforcer of the community's guidelines. Harold's family found themselves caught in the middle of the storm. While grieving their loss privately, they now faced public scrutiny due to Karen's interference. Reporters knocked on their door seeking statements, and strangers sent messages offering condolences mixed with outrage over what had happened. For Harold's wife, Evelyn, the whole ordeal felt unbearable. She couldn't understand why someone would choose that moment to make life harder for her family. Instead of focusing solely on her husband's memory, she was forced to relive the chaos again and again through headlines and hashtags. Amidst the whirlwind, authorities stepped in. Obstructing a funeral procession wasn't just rude, it was illegal in many places, including their town. Officers reviewed witness accounts, security footage from nearby homes, and the viral video before deciding to press charges against Karen. When two uniformed officers showed up at her doorstep later that evening, she was visibly shaken. At first, she tried to explain herself, insisting she hadn't known the legal implications of her actions. "I thought I was protecting my neighborhood," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. but excuses fell flat when faced with the law. Handcuffs clicked around her wrists and she was escorted to the police station. Sitting alone in a holding cell, Karen had plenty of time to reflect on what had led her here. Her initial defiance gave way to regret as reality set in. This wasn't just about embarrassment or losing face in front of her neighbors. This was serious. Criminal charges meant court appearances, potential fines, and possibly even jail time. Worse still, she'd become a symbol of everything people hated about entitled behavior. For someone who prided herself on being respected and admired, this was devastating. News of Karen's arrest spread quickly. Neighbors gathered in small groups, discussing the fallout. Some felt vindicated, glad to see her held accountable for crossing a line. Others, while disapproving of her actions, worried about the precedent this might set. Could calling the police really solve the underlying issues in their community? And then there were those who remained neutral, unsure whether to condemn Karen entirely or give her the benefit of the doubt. Regardless of individual opinions, everyone agreed on one thing. The neighborhood dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Karen's absence created a strange void. Without her constant oversight, the HOA meetings felt quieter, almost eerie. Decisions that once required weeks of deliberation suddenly moved forward without hesitation. Mailboxes stayed regulation-approved shades of beige, and lawns remained perfectly manicured, not because Karen enforced these standards, but because residents realized they could coexist peacefully without micromanagement. For the first time in years, the community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Despite the newfound freedom, not everyone celebrated Karen's downfall. A handful of residents felt sympathy for her plight, recognizing that her intentions, however, misguided, stemmed from a desire to maintain order. They remembered moments when Karen had gone out of her way to help. A lost dog returned, a tree trimmed before it caused damage, or a stray package delivered safely to its owner. These acts of kindness, though overshadowed by her domineering personality, reminded them that Karen was still human, flawed and fallible like anyone else. Meanwhile, Harold's legacy continued to shine brightly. Friends and family organized a special memorial service in his honor, inviting the entire neighborhood to attend. The event served as both a tribute to his life and a chance for healing. Speakers shared heartfelt stories about Harold's generosity, humor, and unwavering optimism. Even those who hadn't known him personally left feeling inspired by the impact he'd made on those around him. At the end of the ceremony, a plaque bearing Harold's name was unveiled near the entrance of the subdivision, a permanent reminder of the man who brought people together, even in death. For Karen, the road ahead promised challenges. Facing criminal charges was daunting enough, but rebuilding her reputation seemed nearly impossible. Once seen as the guardian of the neighborhood, she now bore the weight of public shame. Yet, buried beneath the layers of guilt and humiliation lay a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this experience would teach her humility, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions and reevaluate her priorities. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to redeem herself, not as the enforcer, but as a neighbor willing to listen, learn, and grow. As days turned into weeks, the neighborhood slowly adjusted to its new normal. Life went on, as it always does, but the shadow of Karen's hijacking lingered. It served as a cautionary tale, reminding everyone of the importance of empathy, respect, and understanding. Rules, no matter how well-intentioned, mean little without compassion. And sometimes stepping back is the most powerful act of leadership one can offer. Karen's arrest was the talk of the town for weeks. It wasn't just local gossip anymore, it had become national news. Every late-night comedian seemed to have a joke about funeral Karen, and social media feeds were flooded with memes mocking her actions. Strangers from across the country weighed in, sharing their opinions on everything from HOA overreach to basic human decency. The overwhelming consensus: what Karen did was unacceptable. For someone who had spent years trying to maintain control and enforce order, she suddenly found herself completely powerless. Back in her neighborhood, the mood shifted dramatically. Neighbors who once tiptoed around Karen's demands now openly criticized her behavior. At an emergency HOA meeting held shortly after the incident, voices rose in anger as residents demanded her immediate removal from the board. Some even called for stricter oversight of the HOA itself, arguing that no single person should wield so much authority ever again. After hours of heated debate, Karen reluctantly submitted her resignation, knowing full well that staying in her position would only make things worse. Her reign as the self-appointed queen of the community was officially over, but losing her title wasn't the hardest part. The public shaming that followed cut deeper than any fine or punishment could. Every time Karen left her house, she felt eyes on her, judgmental stares from neighbors she used to boss around. Kids rode their bikes past her driveway, pointing and whispering, "That's Funeral Karen." Graffiti appeared overnight on her garage door, "R.I.P. Respect." Anonymous notes slid under her front door, accusing her of ruining Harold's final farewell. Even trips to the grocery store became unbearable. People whispered behind her back and some outright avoided her, pretending not to see her in the aisles. Karen had always craved attention, but this was not the kind she wanted. Desperate to salvage what remained of her reputation, Karen decided to reach out to Harold's family. She knew an apology wouldn't undo the damage she'd caused, but maybe, if she was sincere, it could be a start. She drafted a letter, carefully choosing her words to express remorse without sounding defensive. When she finally mustered the courage to deliver it in person, Evelyn, Harold's widow, answered the door. Karen stood there awkwardly, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. I'm so sorry," Karen stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I never meant to hurt you or your family. I got carried away." Evelyn didn't say anything at first. She studied Karen's face, searching for sincerity. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "It's too late for apologies," she said softly. "But if you're truly sorry, then prove it. Prove it." Those two words stuck with Karen long after she returned home. How could she possibly make amends for something so hurtful? The answer came unexpectedly when Evelyn suggested community service as a way for Karen to demonstrate genuine remorse. Specifically, she recommended volunteering at a nearby hospice center where Harold had received care during his final days. At first, Karen balked at the idea. Spending time with terminally ill patients sounded daunting and emotionally exhausting. But Evelyn insisted, making it clear that this was the only path to redemption she was willing to offer. Reluctantly, Karen agreed. Her first day at the hospice was nerve-wracking. She arrived dressed in her usual polished attire, clutching a clipboard as though preparing for another HOA inspection. But within minutes, she realized this wasn't going to be like anything she'd done before. The staff welcomed her warmly, explaining that her role would involve simple tasks, delivering meals, reading aloud to patients, helping tidy rooms, and simply being present for those who needed companionship. It was humbling work, far removed from the power dynamics she was accustomed to. At first, Karen struggled. She fumbled through conversations, unsure of what to say to people facing life's most difficult moments. One elderly man named Walter, confined to his bed, asked her why she was there. When she admitted she was doing community service, he chuckled softly. "Well, at least you're honest," he said. That moment stuck with her. Slowly, Karen began to let her guard down. She listened more than she spoke, learning about the lives of the patients she served. She heard stories of love, loss, resilience, and joy, stories that reminded her of Harold and the impact he'd had on their community. Over time, Karen started to change. Volunteering forced her to confront emotions she'd buried beneath layers of control and perfectionism. She saw how fleeting life could be and how precious every moment truly was. The experience softened her edges, teaching her empathy in ways she hadn't thought possible. By the end of her 100-hour commitment, Karen wasn't the same person who had stormed into the middle of Harold's funeral procession. She was quieter, more reflective, and genuinely grateful for the opportunity to give back. Word of Karen's transformation spread slowly but surely. Staff members at the hospice praised her dedication, Noting how much she'd grown since her first awkward days, patients requested her presence, appreciating her kindness and willingness to sit with them during quiet moments. Even Evelyn acknowledged the effort Karen had made, telling her one evening, "You've earned a second chance, don't waste it." Still, forgiveness didn't come easily from everyone. Many neighbors remained skeptical, wondering whether Karen's newfound humility was genuine or just another act. Some refused to speak to her altogether, while others kept their interactions strictly professional. Karen understood their hesitation. Trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy, and she knew she'd burned bridges that might never fully heal. Instead of pushing for reconciliation, she focused on rebuilding her life quietly. She tended to her garden, joined a book club, and occasionally attended community events, always mindful not to draw unnecessary attention to herself. One day, while walking through the neighborhood, Karen noticed children playing basketball in a driveway. In the past, she would have marched over to scold them for making noise or leaving toys scattered about. But this time she smiled instead. She remembered Harold's habit of stopping to chat with kids, offering tips on shooting hoops or sharing stories about his own childhood. Inspired by his example, Karen approached the group hesitantly. "Mind if I join?" she asked, holding up an old basketball she'd found gathering dust in her garage. The kids exchanged surprised looks but shrugged and handed her the ball. For the first time in years, Karen laughed freely, enjoying the simplicity of the game and the company of her neighbors. As months passed, Karen continued to focus on small acts of kindness. She baked cookies for new homeowners, helped organize a neighborhood cleanup day, and even donated money anonymously to families in need. These gestures weren't grand or flashy. They were quiet efforts meant to show that she was trying. And, while not everyone forgave her, some began to soften toward her. They saw the changes in her demeanor, the absence of judgmental comments, and the willingness to lend a hand without expecting anything in return. Karen's journey wasn't easy, nor was it perfect. There were days when old habits crept back, tempting her to criticize or control. But each time she caught herself reminding herself of the lessons she'd learned at the hospice. Life was too short to waste on trivial rules and meaningless power struggles. What mattered most was connection, the bonds we share with others and the legacy we leave behind. By the time the anniversary of Harold's passing rolled around, Karen felt ready to face the community again. She attended the memorial service, held in his honor, sitting quietly near the back. As speakers shared memories of Harold's generosity and warmth, Karen wiped away tears, feeling both sadness and gratitude. Sadness for the pain she'd caused his family, and gratitude for the wake-up call that had pushed her toward growth. When the ceremony ended, Evelyn approached Karen. For a moment, they stood in silence, looking at the plaque bearing Harold's name. Then Evelyn extended her hand. "Thank you for showing up today," she said simply. Karen nodded, shaking Evelyn's hand firmly. No words were needed. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't erase the past, but it offered hope for a better future, for Karen, for the neighborhood, and for anyone willing to learn from their mistakes. The neighborhood slowly began to heal after the storm caused by Karen's actions. The memory of Harold Jenkins lingered like a soft, comforting presence, reminding everyone of the values he stood for: kindness, patience, and community. His plaque, near the entrance of the subdivision, served as more than just a tribute. It became a symbol of unity, a reminder that even in moments of conflict, people could come together to honor what truly mattered. Life moved forward, but the scars left by Karen's hijacking of the funeral procession remained visible, though less raw with time. Karen herself had changed in ways no one expected. Once known as the iron-fisted enforcer of rules, she now lived quietly, almost invisibly within the community she once dominated. She still attended HOA meetings, but only as an observer, sitting silently in the back without offering unsolicited opinions or criticisms. Gone were the days of her sharp tongue and clipboard-wielding authority. Instead, she listened intently, nodding occasionally when others spoke. Some neighbors noticed this shift and appreciated her newfound humility, while others remained wary, unsure if her transformation was genuine or temporary. Her volunteer work at the hospice continued long after her required hours ended. What started as an act of penance turned into something deeper, a passion for helping those navigating life's final chapters. Karen found purpose in the small acts of service she performed daily, reading stories to patients, holding their hands during difficult moments, and ensuring they felt seen and valued. These interactions taught her lessons she never anticipated, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that sometimes the greatest strength came from simply being present. Word of her dedication spread beyond the hospice walls. Staff members praised her reliability and compassion, noting how much she'd grown since her first awkward days there. Patients often requested her specifically, knowing she would bring warmth and understanding to their rooms. One elderly woman named Margaret, who rarely smiled due to chronic pain, told Karen one afternoon, "You remind me of my daughter. She always knew how to make me laugh." That simple compliment brought tears to Karen's eyes, not because it flattered her, but because it showed her that she was making a difference, however small. Back in the neighborhood, Karen's efforts to rebuild trust weren't always smooth. There were still tense encounters. Some residents refused to acknowledge her, entirely turning away when they saw her approaching. Others greeted her politely but kept conversations brief, unwilling to let their guard down completely. Yet Karen didn't push for forgiveness. She understood that healing took time and that earning back trust required consistent effort. So, she focused on small gestures, watering plants for elderly neighbors, organizing food drives, and volunteering at local events. Each action was a step toward proving that she had truly changed. One particularly memorable moment occurred during the annual Fall Festival, a tradition Harold had loved dearly. In years past, Karen had micromanaged every detail, dictating where booths should be placed and which decorations were allowed. This year, however, she took a different approach. She arrived early to help set up, rolling up her sleeves to assist with whatever needed doing. When disagreements arose among volunteers about booth placement, Karen stepped aside, letting others decide without interference. Her restraint surprised many, earning her quiet nods of approval from former critics. As the festival unfolded, Karen wandered through the crowd, taking in the laughter of children, the aroma of baked goods, and the cheerful chatter of neighbors reconnecting. For the first time in years, she felt like part of the community, not above it or outside it, but woven into its fabric. At one point, she stopped by a table selling handmade crafts and purchased a wooden birdhouse painted bright blue. A young boy standing nearby watched curiously as she admired the item. "Why'd you buy that?" he asked innocently. Karen smiled, crouching down to meet his eye level. "Because it reminds me of Harold," she replied. "He loved birds." The boy grinned, clearly pleased with her answer, and scampered off to tell his friends about the strange lady who liked birdhouses. Karen chuckled softly, shaking her head. Moments like these reminded her how far she'd come, and how much farther she still had to go. Despite her progress, Karen couldn't escape the shadow of her past entirely. Every so often, someone would mention that day at the funeral. Procession, either directly to her face or in hushed tones behind her back. Social media hadn't forgotten either. Memes of funeral Karen occasionally resurfaced, sparking fresh waves of mockery. While painful, these reminders kept her grounded, preventing her from slipping back into old habits. They also reinforced a valuable lesson. Actions have consequences, and some mistakes take longer to forgive than others. As months turned into years, Karen's story became part of the neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale passed down during casual conversations or late-night gatherings. Newcomers to the community inevitably heard about the woman who blocked a funeral procession, but they also learned about her redemption arc. Parents used her story to teach their children about accountability and second chances, emphasizing that even those who make grave errors can find a path to forgiveness if they're willing to work for it. Harold's legacy played a significant role in Karen's transformation. His memory inspired not only her personal growth but also broader changes within the neighborhood. Residents formed committees focused on fostering kindness and inclusivity, hosting events that encouraged connection rather than division. A scholarship fund was established in Harold's name, supporting students pursuing careers in caregiving fields. Even the HOA adopted a gentler tone under new leadership, prioritizing collaboration over control. For Karen, the most profound change was internal. She no longer craved validation through power or perfection. Instead, she found fulfillment in the quiet moments, the shared smiles, the heartfelt conversations, and the knowledge that she was contributing positively to her community. Though she knew she'd never fully erase the stain of her past actions, she accepted that redemption wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about learning from them and striving to do better each day. On the 5th anniversary of Harold's passing, the neighborhood gathered once again to celebrate his life. The event was larger than ever, with hundreds of attendees filling the park where Harold had often walked his dog. Speeches were given, songs were sung, and memories were shared. Near the end of the ceremony, Evelyn approached the microphone, holding a folded piece of paper. "I want to share something special today," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "This is a letter I received recently, from someone who wanted to express gratitude for Harold's influence on their life." Evelyn paused, scanning the crowd until her gaze landed on Karen. Then she read aloud, "Dear Evelyn, thank you for giving me the chance to prove myself. Harold taught me what it means to live with heart, to care for others without expecting anything in return. Because of him, and because of your kindness, I've learned to see the world differently. I hope I can continue honoring his memory by being the person he believed we all should be, compassionate, patient, and loving. Thank you for believing in me, even when I struggled to believe in myself." The audience erupted into applause, many wiping away tears. When Evelyn finished reading, she looked directly at Karen and nodded warmly. Karen, seated near the front, felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't expected her private note to be shared publicly, but she realized it was fitting. Redemption, after all, wasn't meant to be hidden. It was meant to inspire. As the ceremony concluded, Karen walked over to the plaque bearing Harold's name. She placed a single yellow rose at its base, whispering a silent thank you. Then, glancing around, at the smiling faces of her neighbors, she allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but she finally felt like she belonged. Not as the ruler of the neighborhood, but as a member of its family. In the end, Karen's journey was a testament to the power of growth and grace. She proved that no matter how far someone strays from the path of kindness, there's always a way back, if they're willing to take the steps. And while her story might forever carry echoes of regret, it also carried hope. Hope for forgiveness, for renewal, and for the enduring impact of a single life well lived.